Well, welcome everybody to the third installment of the Evidence-Based Compliance Assurance webinar series. Please visit our website for a complete description of all our upcoming talks. I will post a link shortly in the chat box. We are delighted to host Jodi Short's talk. Jodi Short is the Honorable Roger G. Traynor Professor of Law at UC Hastings College of Law. Her research is on the regulation of business, in particular the intersection of public and private regulatory regimes and the theory and practice of regulatory reform. Jodi will be talking about monitoring, a review of research and inspection and compliance for regulators. Please feel free to post questions in the chat box, and I will do my best to pass them on to Jodi in a timely manner. Without further ado, please take it over.
All right, thank you. So thank you for inviting me to be here for today and to participate in this conversation with you. I know that these are challenging times. You are being asked to do more with less, and to be honest, it may seem acute, but this has been the case for a very long time, and that's really what a lot of this research is about. To try to give you some tools to think about how you can design monitoring regimes to maximize the compliance that comes out on the other end. So that's what my hope is here today. So let me first give you a roadmap for how I'm planning to approach the webinar today. I want to start by walking you through the trajectory of academic research on inspection and compliance. And this is really just to give you an idea of where researchers are coming from. What are the kinds of questions that motivate them to, kind of give you some insight into the types of research that they produce. I want to discuss some key findings on which there's broad consensus among academics, and I'll be interested to get your reactions on whether you share their consensus. And then I want to discuss some current directions in research and some specific findings coming out of that research, and ultimately learn your reaction to the academic findings and get your input, hopefully, on what would be some fruitful questions for academics to pursue in the future. Along the way, let me just signpost for you. We're going to be pausing at various points in the presentation to push out some polling questions to you. And this is really just to kind of, the polling questions are pretty reductive given the way that we're allowed to set them up in the software. They're really just kind of designed to provoke some thinking on your part, and the hope is that you'll go ahead and give us your your gut reactions to the polling questions that we push out. But if they do provoke some additional thought of complexity beyond what we're able to put in the polling question, I hope that you'll just write about that in the chat box separately so we can pick up that thread of dialogue. Okay, so let me just get started with really where the academic research on inspection starts. So it starts with the idea of the street-level bureaucrat. The street-level bureaucrat is basically the public human face of a regulatory agency. The individuals who have day-to-day interaction with the regulated community, the regulatory beneficiaries of a particular program. So, this could be someone like a staff member at the DMV, a caseworker at the Social Security Administration, or an inspector at the EPA. And there are really three broad general insights that come out of this research that wind up motivating a lot of research that comes after. So the first is that the implementation, the way that these line levels are implemented on the ground. So that's one key insight. The second is that line-level staff at agencies have enormous discretion in how regulations get implemented. So obviously, political appointees are making a lot of decisions about what the law means and how it will be implemented. But day to day, hour to hour, the people on the front lines of implementation are making decisions that matter in terms of what law means. And then the third is that this discretion that the line level staff that the agency inspectors are exercising is shaped by a whole host of social factors. And that's really where the research comes in, right? To try and figure out what exactly is it that shapes the way inspectors are doing their jobs. And so research has identified a whole host of factors that shape inspectors' discretion. Everything from the way they're trained professionally, the way their agency organizations are structured, their politics, the politics in which they're embedded, their own self-interest, their identity concerns, and finally their relationships. And this is really what I want to use as a jumping off point. The research on inspection became very interested in the impact of relationships between regulators and regulated entities. And that kind of took the form in developing this stylized type of inspection styles, right? And I guess the polarized way to convey this, and there's some nuances, but the idea was that there is a reasonable inspector. There are also unreasonable inspectors, right? And that's really the foil. So I'm going to start there. The unreasonable inspector is basically an inspector who's very rigid, mechanistic, legalistic in the way that they apply the law, even if they're going to impose a lot of unnecessary costs on regulated entities. But it's that idea of rigidity, inflexibility, and just a sort of legalistic approach to inspection. There's also kind of an orientation towards regulated entities that this embodies, this notion that the unreasonable inspector kind of sees the regulated entity as the enemy, thinks they're all just out to make a buck and to get around regulations and cut corners wherever they can. And, that's kind of the standpoint from which the inspection begins. And then finally, just sort of the notion that this type of inspector, the unreasonable inspector, is just kind of relying on abstract theories that are really disconnected from practical business realities. So that is the foil, and the idealized version of this has been known in the literature as the reasonable inspector. So basically, the reasonable inspector overcomes all of these sort of foibles that the unreasonable inspector has. They're flexible and cooperative. They tailor regulatory requirements to fit individual cases. And so that means that maybe they overlook violations in some cases where they don't pose significant risk, or they take account of an establishment's reasonable efforts to comply. Means that they act as, kind of a consultant or a partner with a regulated entity, not just a cop. And they'll help regulated entities identify root causes of violations, provide compliance assistance. The reasonable inspector is kind of coming from a place of respect, and the idea is that they sort of validate the contributions that regulated entities make to society, and they exercise their judgment ultimately informed by practical experience, not just kind of abstract theory. So, the whole notion of the reasonable inspector has been lampooned a little bit as a myth, right? I mean, to embody all of those qualities, a person would have to have the wisdom of Solomon, the craftiness of Ulysses, and the fortitude of Winston Churchill, one critic suggests. And so I guess I want to open it up to you at this point with our first two polling questions. They should appear in the chat box soon. And I just want to get a sense of, what your exposure to this kind of model of inspection has been.
We're only going to be able to share one of the polls at a time, so folks.
Oh, got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the first one, just asking if you've been encouraged by your agency to adopt the kind of reasonable or cooperative approach to inspection that was described in the presentation. Oh, it says the poll is closed.
Okay. Let's see. How about now?
Yep, I'm seeing it. Although we're still missing a lot of responses.
Okay.
So let's just give people a minute now that it's up.
I see more responses coming in.
Yeah, they're coming in. Great. Okay, so far, overwhelmingly, I'm seeing that that people have been encouraged to adopt cooperative approaches to inspection. Why don't we go ahead and put up the next polling question?
Okay.
And so this is about what your experience with those kinds of approaches have been, and whether, in your view, you've found those to be an effective way to achieve compliance. Okay, great. So this is really interesting. I mean, what I'm seeing here is the overwhelming majority here are kind of taking a nuanced approach to the answer, saying that it depends, and that really is what the research has to say as well. When Ben takes down the poll, we can get back to the slides, but. I mean, I guess I've started here not because I think that, you know, this is the most important insight that one can get out of the literature. The literature is actually really divided on whether and when these sort of cooperative approaches to inspection actually produce better compliance. And, you know, I guess I could sum it up by saying that there is not a clear empirical link between inspector reasonableness or cooperativeness and actual compliance outcomes. And, you know, there's a real mismatch here, because I think that these approaches to regulation have been so widely picked up by agencies that that are looking to market themselves to the regulated community, that are looking to do more with less, and, you know, it's a feel-good approach that it's pretty easy to get behind politically. So there's been a big push among many agencies to adopt these kinds of reasonable approaches, and yet the literature doesn't really give us a clear sense that they are going to produce better compliance outcomes. And in fact, the research actually has some cautionary notes about this. There was a recent survey of both regulators and regulated entities that found the following. First, they found that environmental inspectors actually do act reasonably in the terms that we're talking about, in the sense that they are less likely to issue notices of violation if they believe that there will be bad consequences financially for the firm, or if the inspector knows that the firm has made an effort in that they've participated in a voluntary beyond compliance program. So that's the regulator side, right? Kind of implementing this reasonable model. Here's the regulated entity side. Companies report that they don't respond to those kinds of overtures with compliance. And in fact, what compliance managers reported to the survey research is that they are more likely to commit a violation if their company had been investigated in the past, but not cited for a violation. So there are some downsides, and there are some dangers to exercising the kind of forbearance that is envisioned by that model in certain. Okay, well, so anyway, this summarizes basically what I've been talking about. So I'm going to go ahead and move on. So somebody asked a question about the terminology reasonableness, unreasonableness. I mean, these are stylized academic terms, and, you know, kind of creating ideal types. And I think that the point of the commenter is very well taken. And this really goes to what people were saying in response to the second polling question, that what is objectively reasonable in a given situation may depend on a lot of contingencies. So I appreciate that point. Yes, I'm going to post the slides. I'm going to post the slides afterwards. And at the end of the slides, there's a bibliography containing all the studies that are cited here. So let's move on to some of the inspection practices that research has established are associated with compliance. So there are 5 categories that I'm going to talk about. The first is robust monitoring. The second is clear, consistent communication and application of regulatory requirements. The third is building relationships with key organizational actors. The fourth is creating the perception of fairness in application of the law. And the fifth is building alliances with other agencies and civil society stakeholders. So let me first go first. The inspection promotes compliance. So there are many studies demonstrating that more heavily monitored facilities exhibit better environmental compliance than other facilities. Now, these are large observational studies that just show that the more a facility has been inspected, the better compliance that it tends to exhibit. But that raises the question of whether inspection is actually causally related to compliance. There is actually evidence. Now my slides disappeared. There is actually evidence that inspections are causally related to improvements in compliance. So there's a study coming from the workplace safety context. In a natural field experiment, the researchers there showed that companies that were subject to random OSHA inspections showed a 9.4% decrease in injury rates compared with similarly situated but uninspected firms. And that provides some powerful evidence that it is the act of inspection itself that can help, in part, drive compliance. I just wanted to bring your attention to a recent study in the environmental context called When the Regulator Goes Home, the Effectiveness of Environmental Oversight. So this study is about firms falling into and out of non-attainment. I'm sorry, not firms. This is about firms located in areas that are falling into and out of non-attainment status. So it shows that on the front end, when an area goes into non-attainment status and is subject to all the additional regulatory oversight that accompanies that, the firms in that area reduce their emissions. It also shows, and I think this is the somewhat more surprising thing, that when those areas go out of non-attainment status, when they are back in attainment and they are no longer subject to the kind of stringent regulatory oversight associated with non-attainment status, the firms in those areas actually decrease their compliance. They increase their emissions. And this is even when kind of hard technological solutions have been adopted. So the study shows that NOx emissions from boilers with abatement technology attached increased by 16% in those areas that went from non-attainment to attainment status. And now, obviously, there are lots of requirements. There are lots of things associated with moving from attainment to non-attainment and back again. But the researchers do point to the additional regulatory oversight associated with non-attainment status as one factor in explaining why they're seeing these increases in emissions when areas fall back into attainment.
And let me read it to you, Jodi.
Okay, great. Okay.
Are there any studies examining criminal enforcement actions and compliance, not just prosecution, but investigations, search warrants, indictments, resulting in increased compliance similar to the more heavily monitored facilities?
It's a great question. I am not aware of any such studies, and I suspect it's because there's so few relative to civil enforcement that it would be hard to compare. It would be hard to get good traction on an empirical comparison between the compliance impacts of criminal enforcement versus the compliance impacts of civil enforcement. But I mean, it's a great idea. I'm not aware of any studies. Okay, you can go ahead and switch to the next slide, Ben. Okay, so key finding number 2, clear and consistent communication of regulatory requirements promotes compliance. So one example here is there's a study of building contractors that shows that they were less compliant when they were subject to the jurisdiction of multiple regulators that had distinct requirements. and also when the same inspector from a single agency gave them inconsistent information about compliance. Okay, so moving to the other side, another example of this is a study of small food industry businesses that found that there was more compliance when inspectors were very clear and direct about conveying the regulatory requirements to these establishments. And so this is an interesting study because it it gets at this tension between the cooperative approaches to regulation and the more rigid legalistic approaches. One might take a regulator just kind of very directly stating what the requirements are, what needs to be done, what's going to happen if you don't do it. That might be perceived as rigid. What these researchers found was that these small food industry establishments actually really appreciated that kind of clarity, and they were not interested in engaging in the kind of dialogue that flexible approaches anticipate. So the inspectors in this study were kind of divided into groups where some gave the establishments clear, direct, concise summaries of the requirements, and some were told to engage in dialogue with the establishment about the requirements and about their application. That was really off-putting to these small businesses. They didn't really have a whole lot of input, and in fact, it turned out that they didn't really know a whole lot about the regulatory requirements. There was a real knowledge gap. The researchers found that 43% of small businesses cited for violations mistakenly thought that they were in compliance. And so the task here for inspectors in this context was just to convey the information to them about what it meant to comply. So, this points to the importance of understanding exactly what it is that's driving non-compliance in your domain. And that leads me to our polling question number 2. So I think we have a slide change and a polling question push out for Ben.
I'm on it.
Okay, thanks. Okay.
Question 2. Okay. The poll is open now, and I'm just going to go ahead and show results to everyone. But don't let other people's answers influence your own. Jodi, can you see?
I can, yeah. And actually now I have the option to take over as presenter, so I may try that after the poll and see what happens.
Okay.
Okay, so this is interesting. I mean, what I'm seeing here is a variety of different responses, and I would expect that because you all work in a variety of different contexts, and there may be different motivators for non-compliance, different explanations for non-compliance in different settings. And so one of the things that's coming out of the research is to suggest the importance of really understanding the root causes of non-compliance in terms of thinking about how you're going to structure your monitoring regime. So circling back to some of the practical implications coming out of this area of research, to harmonize standards and coordinate enforcement across agencies for consistency, to focus inspector training on consistency, and we'll talk about some ways to do that a little later on. And just also not to let a focus on reasonableness or cooperativeness undermine clarity. So in the chat box, I agree that I think that one of the things that study points out is that one of the things that determines how you might think about structuring a monitoring regime and what approach to take to monitored entities might depend on whether they're small or large entities. And, a large entity with a massive legal and compliance department might be very interested in engaging in dialogue with the inspector about things, whereas a smaller entity without those kinds of resources and without that kind of institutional knowledge, much less interested. So there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Okay, Jody, let me just chime in. Remember, there's some people on audio, so they might not be able to see the questions, which is
Okay.
why I'm reading them.
Oh, I see.
Do the studies on clearly communicating requirements distinguish between small and large facilities or businesses? And it's a longer question, but I think that's enough for people to understand what you answered.
Yeah, that's what I was responding to. So the studies, I'm unaware of a study that actually compares small and large entities, but that last study that I presented about the food establishment, the small food industry businesses, I think that was an important factor determining the outcome in that particular study. And so, I think this is an important point about reading studies. You kind of want to be very attentive to the factual context in which the study took place. And so what I would take from this study is that these kind of cooperative approaches are particularly ill-suited for these kinds of small businesses. That doesn't mean that they're not well suited to other kinds of businesses that have other kinds of resources and, kind of just organizational styles. Okay, so let me move on to the third set of findings. Building relationships through direct and sustained interactions with regulated entities promotes compliance. So the building contractors, the different study of building contractors that found that building contractors that had direct face-to-face contact with inspectors in the field were more likely than those who did not have that kind of contact to report the following. First, that inspectors were cooperative and helpful. So they had a positive view of the regulator. And second, that they found it important to comply with regulatory requirements in order to maintain a good reputation with the inspector. They wanted to save face. So they at least reported that gave them more motivation to comply. There was also a study of EPA inspectors and the kinds of alliances that they were able to form with compliance personnel at a university where the agency was implementing a consent decree on protocols at the university laboratories. So this study found that EPA inspectors were able to develop close relationships and rapport with these compliance personnel, and that really caused the compliance personnel inside the university to become allies and to help foster compliance inside of the organization. This was really contingent. I mean, that's not to say that every employee inside of an organization is a candidate for playing this kind of role, but what the researchers said was that these compliance personnel at the university had two qualities that allowed them to do that. They had the professional expertise that allowed them to relate, kind of in a peer sort of relationship with EPA inspectors. And they also had status inside the university that allowed them the autonomy to push their own agenda. And so taken together, the kind of practical implications that I would pull out of these studies is the first is you might be cautious about approaches to inspection that reduce face-to-face interaction between inspectors and regulated entities. I know that desk inspections have become more prevalent in, at least in my region, out in Region 9. I'm not sure about across the country. In the last many years, actually, this is not a super recent development. And there are reasons for that, right? I mean, that increases coverage. But what the studies suggest is that there may be trade-offs between coverage and efficacy to the extent that you remove the face-to-face interaction of the inspection process. And then the second is that it's worth strategizing about how you can identify allies within regulated organizations to promote compliance from the inside. Key finding number 4, I'm going to go through this quickly. I think there's not a whole lot that can be done operationally about this, but just important to flag, and it can be important framing, just to make sure that you communicate to regulated entities that this is something the agency does. So fairness and application of the law has been found to promote compliance. And that means two different things. One is it means equal application of the law. Basically what this means is that regulated entities want to know that their competitors are being monitored too. And so, for instance, the building contractors were more likely to comply with regulatory requirements when they knew that these requirements were being enforced on other contractors. And then there are a lot of just procedural justice things, right? That there's fair process, there's transparency, opportunities for voice. Again, all of those things I know are part of your administrative process, but it's worth just highlighting and making sure regulated entities know that the agency is aware of its obligation to apply the law fairly and that it's doing so. Any insight on how sustained interaction translates to inspection frequency? No, no, I'm not aware of studies that compare how these interactions, how effective these interactions were, depending on how frequently the establishment was inspected. Studies are really difficult to do because, particularly in the environmental context, the inspections tend to be intermittent. And I guess the consent decree was an example of a place where you had that kind of ongoing interaction. So that may have been a little bit idiosyncratic. But I think the building contractors are a good example of just kind of the social process of interaction, the fact that a manager at the regulated entity is looking an inspector in the face, and there's just kind of a relational quality to it. Could that be built up by more frequent interactions? It's actually a really interesting question. I'm going to talk in a few slides about how there's a dark side to relationships as well. I think that these, the findings I just presented about these kind of sustained interactions is just really about putting a human face to the agency and having the agency put a human face to the regulated entity. But I'll pick that back up in a few minutes. Okay, so the last area of findings is about how monitoring alliances can promote compliance. And a lot of these studies, I will say, come from regulatory agencies in emerging economies, in places where regulators are incredibly under-resourced and where agencies have very little autonomy from their political principles. And so they've kind of sought to create these alliances that will strengthen their ability to do enforcement work. And I present them just because, I think that they were once thought to be, these were thought to be idiosyncratic contexts. And I guess I want to suggest that that these are constraints that all regulatory agencies face, both in developed and in developing economies. So it's worth thinking outside the box about what kinds of alliances agencies might be able to create in order to support their mission. So let me start with the different categories of alliances. So there can be alliances with citizens. So for instance, there are studies in the Chinese context about environmental enforcement showing that when a Chinese Environmental Protection Bureau could demonstrate a lot of citizen complaints coming in, they were able to access enforcement resources that they were not otherwise able to access. And it created some political will behind what they were doing that was lacking before. Media, there are a number of studies about how media exposés of health, safety, and environmental disasters generated public support for more stringent enforcement. And there's some interesting interviews in these studies with regulators saying that they see it as part of their job to kind of cultivate relationships with media that are going to help explain the importance of their enforcement work. Civil society organizations. So a study in Argentina about labor inspection found that labor inspectors were able to expand their inspection programs by developing social and organizational ties with labor unions. This literally came down to labor unions would provide them with cars that would allow them to drive out to factories that they would never otherwise be able to inspect because they simply did not have the resources. There are also similar studies in the domestic context, partnering with NGOs to provide support for worker claims of wages and hours violations, for instance, and also partnerships with other regulators. So there's studies in South America about prosecutors enforcing environmental and labor law more effectively in some cases than the civil regulators. and of labor inspectors creatively partnering with bank regulators to find, to identify and monitor wage violations. So it's worth thinking about how these kinds of partnerships might be developed in your context as well. And I'm going to skip that polling question and just blow right on to the current trends in inspection and enforcement research, the factors influencing inspector performance, peer review, and private monitors and bias. So let me talk first about the factors influencing inspector performance. And we're going to get soon to the follow-up on relationships. I see there's some chat about that. So a number of different factors have been found in studies to influence the extent to which inspectors accurately and robustly monitor the entities that they're charged with monitoring. So experience is one factor that tends to cause monitors to be able to identify more violations, the confidence to cite more violations. Though experience can be a double-edged sword, right? Sometimes experience can lead to jadedness. And so there have been some studies suggesting that, for instance, in the FDA context, more experienced inspectors are not likely to find a facility in total non-compliance. That's kind of a highly non-compliant category. And with a certain level of experience, FDA inspectors just stop putting facilities into that category. Training has the effect that you would hope. Auditors who have been given more training find and report more violations. Gender, this is kind of an unusual one. In a study that I did with some colleagues, we found that teams of auditors inspecting supply chain factories who had at least one woman on the team reported more violations than all male teams. So just an interesting dimension to think about in terms of staffing. Okay, so here's the piece about relationships. The relationships that inspectors have with the entities they regulate influence the way that inspectors perform their jobs. And this is what I call the dark side of relationships. So there are a number of examples of this, and they really all cut in the same direction. So restaurant inspectors that are new to the inspected establishment reported 12.7 to 17.5% more violations than inspectors returning to the same restaurant. Supply chain audited teams that were entirely new to the audited factory reported more violations than teams that had returning auditors on them. The likelihood of product recalls increases at plants that have been inspected by the same inspector more than once, presumably because those inspectors missing things. And there are a lot of different explanations for this. I just kind of saw in passing some speculation in the chat box. I mean, certainly bias in favor of of a regulated entity with whom the regulator has a cozy relationship could be one thing. And it could also just be more cognitive processes. It's sort of once an inspector has gone to a factory, they may just have blinders on, right? They saw a certain thing, they go back expecting to see the same things. But where somebody with fresh eyes comes in and sees a whole new, different universe of things. And so I guess I would be cautious about attributing bad motives to inspectors. There could be lots of just, kind of psychological and cognitive reasons why an inspector who continues to inspect the same facility over and over and over again becomes a little less effective as time goes on. Okay, and then the last thing I would point out is inspector schedules. So there's a pretty new study out about how the way that inspections are scheduled influences how inspectors cite violations. So this study found that restaurant inspectors cited more violations after they inspect establishments with poor compliance levels or trends. So I guess you would call this just kind of maybe a frustration penumbra or something like that. If an inspector goes out on an inspection and finds a ton of violations or finds that the facility is deteriorating in their compliance, they really carry that frustration onto the next facility. And this study suggests that they look extra hard at that next facility. So that could be a good thing or a bad thing, right? I mean, it makes sure that there's a level of stringency, but of course you don't want inspectors just taking out their frustration on whoever happens to be the next facility. The other thing is just about the inspectors' fatigue, basically. Restaurant inspectors are found to cite fewer violations if they've had a lot of other inspections previously in the day and are experiencing fatigue, or when they're conducting an inspection at the end of their scheduled shift and the inspection risks sort of going over long and extending the workday. So just some kind of simple things that can be considered in terms of scheduling and slotting different inspections. So all of these factors, I guess I want to come back to this idea of consistency, right? All these factors that we've talked about that influence inspector performance suggest that there's no objectivity, right? There are all sorts of factors influencing how inspectors are going to cite violations. And yet consistency is a really important value in monitoring regimes. And so are there ways that we can promote more consistency? So a recent study experimented with how this might be done through the use of peer review. So this was a study conducted with the King County Health Department. And in the study, inspectors were randomly assigned either to just follow standard inspection protocols or to participate in an intensive peer review program. And what that program did was it designated pairs of inspectors who would jointly visit establishments, but separately assess their health code violations. So they were going to the same establishments at the same time, viewing the exact same conditions, then they would separately write up their violations. And then afterwards, they would deliberate about where there were divergences in the way that they had cited violations. So some really interesting findings. They found that initially the inconsistency across inspectors was just astronomical. Observing identical facility conditions, inspectors initially disagreed about how the health code applied 60% of the time. But through the peer review process, they found that they were able to massively decrease that inconsistency and at the same time increase the violations that were identified by nearly 20%. So the gains that they were able to get through this process were pretty dramatic. And they also found that there were some kind of spillover effects of this peer review program that were really positive for the agency. The inspectors that had participated in peer review program relative to the other inspectors reported much higher levels of work satisfaction, and they actually stayed at the agency longer. So it promoted employee retention, and those can be really important for the agency to do its work as well. Okay, we're going to skip polling question 4, and let me just get to, I think this is my last substantive slide here. I have this slide because so many regulatory programs are integrating third-party independent monitors, private monitors, as a way to just stretch resources. You know, I mean, we know how strapped you are for inspection resources, and it can be really attractive to try and outsource that function and get third-party inspectors to do some of the work. There's some cautions associated with this. There's a lot of research suggesting that third-party monitors are more lenient when the monitored firm pays them directly. There is research suggesting that third-party monitors are more lenient when they monitor firms that are prospective clients for their other services. And there's research suggesting that third-party monitors are more lenient when they face more competition, and regulated entities can basically go monitoring shopping in a highly competitive market. So this suggests a couple of considerations in integrating third-party private auditors into government regulatory programs. Ideally, you want to try and mitigate the financial incentives that create bias. But another thing you can do is to check their work, you know, and not repeat their work, but spot checks. And so this actually comes from a working paper that I'm working on right now, where we found that third-party auditors retained by companies to audit their suppliers' compliance with codes of conduct perform better after the company introduces its own in-house auditors into the market. That doesn't mean it completely has to replace them. It can introduce only a handful of its own auditors, and the performance of the third-party independent auditors rises. They start citing and finding more violations. And so the suggestion would be that instead of entirely abandoning certain domains to independent third-party auditors, the regulator too could engage in this kind of concurrent sourcing strategy where they rely to a certain extent on independent third-party auditors, but send some of their own agency auditors out into the field to do spot checks. Okay, so I'm going to blow by this and just get, so I think I want to end here because I know that we are running short on time, and I'm very interested in hearing more of the questions that you have for me, in hearing about how the studies that I've presented to you compare with your own experience. And I would be really interested to hear if you think that there are important questions that remain unanswered, what you think that researchers should be spending their time doing. So I see from Catherine, that seems to focus on corporate entities, not mom and pop facilities. What does the that refer?
I think maybe the third-party inspections.
The third-party inspections?
That's my guess.
Oh, no, definitely not. Definitely not exclusively, no. I mean, some of the findings, like for instance, the supply chain research is about audits of supplier factories in developing countries, many of whom are quite small and not large branded companies. So yeah, I would say that those findings have held across a range of different contexts. Hang on a second, I'm losing a little track here. Let me, how does rewarding inspectors for finding violations impact? That is a really interesting question. I am not aware of research on rewards for inspectors finding violations. What I am aware of, there used to be a program at the Department of Health and Human Services for third-party inspectors looking into Medicare fraud and Medicaid fraud. And it actually provided bounties to them for identifying instances of Medicare or Medicaid fraud. And that did, in fact, incentivize the findings of violations. There was a lot of howling in the regulated community about overly stringent inspections by these third-party auditors. And I mean, at least anecdotally, there was some evidence that it overly incentivized these party auditors to find things that weren't necessarily there. So that kind of providing those sort of high-powered incentives can be problematic. And so I think perhaps the better focus is to try to remove the negative incentives rather than providing the positive incentives. Before I get to Paul, hang on, I saw that Amy had something. Curious if there have been any studies comparing federal and state inspections of the same program. I am not aware of them, and in fact, I mean, in the EPA data that I have used, what we found is that most of the inspections that wind up in that data are coming from the states. So it would be hard to do a comparison, and I have not seen those kind of comparisons done. I would be interested to know what your intuitions are about what the distinction would be. Carolyn, research on the effects of criminal enforcement. Okay, great. I would love to see that too. And I can get in touch with some colleagues in criminology who might have a better sense of that. I may be unaware of studies that are out there, but I'm happy to follow up if I'm able to find something on that. Paul, did the King County study compare the cost effectiveness of peer review versus status quo? That is a good question, and I do not believe that they did that. It is, I mean, that is a difficulty with that kind of intervention. Obviously, sending 2 inspectors out to facilities when I know that you barely have enough inspectors to, to provide for 1 raises costs dramatically. And so there's some real trade-offs. There is all I can say, and to my recollection, they did not measure those trade-offs. Let's see. Has there been any research on the effectiveness of a reduced fine but very quick enforcement resolution? So I am not aware of any research on the balance between fine and enforcement and sort of enforcement efficiency or rapidity in the environmental context. There's a lot of research just in the broader field of compliance and deterrence about how the levels of a fine are less associated with compliance outcomes than the certainty that the fine will be applied. And so certainty can be a function of a lot of different things, right? So it's not just the speed with which the sanction is imposed, but that can be part of it. It also has to do with the likelihood that the violator will be caught. And so what matters much more in promoting compliance is not necessarily the level of the fine, it's whether the potential violator believes with some amount of certainty that they will be caught and that the sanction will in fact be applied. Sorry, I keep getting kicked down in the chat box here. I have something from Andrea. Is there any research on the relative effectiveness of follow-up communications after facility inspections? She notices of violations as opposed to enforcement actions. I am not aware of such research. Ben actually might be able to speak to that a little bit in a recent study that he conducted with the state of Maryland in lead paint compliance. He actually found, he had a non-finding that was, I think, somewhat disappointing. They sent out a bunch of compliance letters to contractors that were out of compliance with the state requirements. Some of those contractors just received a letter. Others received not only the letter, but follow-up communications through either 1 email or 3 emails. And they found that there was basically no difference in eventual compliance as between the contractors who received just the letter, 1 follow-up email, 3 follow-up emails. So that's the only research I'm aware of. But I don't know, Ben, do you want to jump in and speak to that?
I also can't provide any additional research, but I can affirm that there's interest by lots of people about the differences between notice of violations and follow-up enforcement actions, but I don't know about the research.
Yeah, and so I mean, if you find yourself inspired by any of these questions and you believe that you are operating in a research context where a study could be designed, I really urge you to get in touch with Ben or I following the presentation. We would be happy to talk to you, either about partnering, either with us or other researchers. There are lots of people out here doing this kind of research. Or just about how you might think about it more informally, setting up an experiment inside of your agency. We'd be happy to do that. Okay, Cynthia, is there any research about rotation of inspectors and the best timing of rotation? Okay, so, I mean, there's a lot of research that suggesting that rotation is really important, just going back to the downsides of these close relationships that inspectors and regulated entities form. Just because there are so few rotation regimes, rotation has been incredibly difficult to adopt as policy. The Public Company Accounting Oversight Board has been trying to do it for years, and they just can't they can't get over the political hurdles involved. And so unfortunately, we don't have very many good rotation systems in place that would allow for a robust study of that. I mean, there's some, but I'm unaware of such a study. And so we're kind of left with the somewhat unsatisfying, I guess, operational insight for you all that yeah, it'd be a great idea to rotate auditors, but we don't. That's something I think for future research and for experimentation going forward.
I want to jump in real quick and say we're at the end of the scheduled time, so I want to thank everyone for coming and remind them that you can find information about the next webinar at epic-evidence.org/webinars. The next presenter will be Sarah Stafford on June 17th. And Jodi, you are welcome to continue answering questions as long as you want to do that. We can also wrap up now if that's your preference.
I'm happy to do that. Yeah, I see a couple more in the queue here. If other people want to stick around, I can stick around. I don't want to keep, Ben is hosting, so I don't want to keep you over long either. But are you okay to
Yes.
hang out for a few minutes? Okay,
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, well, thank you everyone for participating, and feel free to get in touch offline if you have other questions that were not answered in the presentation. Okay, so I'm going back to Amy's. We have various types of inspections. Some are more comprehensive and others are more like spot checks. Any reports out there on whether one type of inspection is more effective? I am unaware of any, Amy, but we can talk about how to create a study for that. Okay, I read somewhere that a criminal penalty, no matter how small, promoted compliance because companies have no line item for a fine. Yeah, so Carolyn, the evidence on this is mixed. There is some evidence about the relative efficacy of criminal sanctions versus civil sanctions on regulated entities generally. I'm not aware of them in the environmental context, but generally. And I think that there's some debate about this in the literature. I tend to think that criminal sanctions do matter a lot partly for the reasons that you're saying. Although at the end of, I mean, so I guess the counter argument to the arguments that you are citing is that at the end of the day, for a corporation, a criminal penalty is just a fine. And, so there's a way in which companies can budget for criminal sanctions as well as for civil sanctions. I tend to disagree with that because I think that there are, in the criminal context, there are a lot of other remedies that regulators or prosecutors have that your civil regulators simply do not have. And those can run from debarment to monitorships to, I think the kinds of things that you were talking about. So I think that there is a qualitative and a meaningful difference between criminal sanctions and civil sanctions. Now, at the same time, criminal sanctions are much more difficult to apply, right? There are higher standards of proof. There can be a lot of political blowback when prosecutors get involved. And so that starts bumping up against the certainty of penalty application. So there are all sorts of different trade-offs. But I guess I certainly do share your intuition that criminal enforcement actions have very different effects than civil enforcement actions. Makes me wonder about the impact of imprisonment to compliance in the industry. Are there any, I'm not aware of studies about imprisonment. I mean, again, imprisonment is so rare that there aren't really studies of it. There has been a lot of talk in the last several years about, among folks who talk about corporate criminal enforcement, about the idea that we should be putting people in jail, right? That we shouldn't just be imposing criminal fines on corporations because, again, what's the difference really between that and a civil fine? That you actually need to have executives behind bars. That has happened in the environmental context. There are a few people sitting behind bars for environmental crimes, but that number is vanishingly small. And so it's hard to believe that that is a real motivator of compliance because the chance of that happening is so remote. But that's not to say that there aren't good arguments for doing it, because there is nothing like the prospect of a perp walk to to kind of impress upon a corporate executive the importance of certain legal requirements. So okay, let's see. Let me go back. Carolyn. Okay, so I've got Carolyn, Glenn. The references will be at the very end of the slides. If you're still on, I can show you. I promise I've got them in there. They're all at the end of the slide presentation, okay? So, and Ben will be posting the slides for you all. Oh, this is Ben. Oh, sorry, okay, Ben's already seen the slides forward and back, so he knows. Then again, John Silverman. Hello, friend. I've been wondering where you are. So let's see, Carolyn, your last message. Oh, Granshall, okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you. You are still incredibly up to date on the literature. Anything else? Does the fee amount matter? Okay, so there's a lot of research suggesting that within the boundaries in which agencies are actually able to set fines, the amount does not matter a whole lot. The fact is that based on statutory constraints, based on political constraints, it is very difficult for agencies to set fines at a level that actually exceeds the benefits that many companies gain from violating the law. And so that is why, I mean, you would have to, so I mean, deterrence theory is basically that a company is going to violate the law if it believes that the benefits from violating the law will exceed the present value of the fine. Right? The value of the fine discounted by the probability that you're going to get caught. And because inspection resources are so thin, because the probability of getting caught for something is so slim, then you have to discount those fine numbers, and they become very, very small. Even a fine that looks large on paper, in a calculation that a regulated entity is making, it's going to look very small because they'll discount it by the probability with which they think it will be imposed on them. And so what research has found is that the bigger mover than actually raising the number of the fine is to increase the probability that the violator will get caught. That gets you more traction on compliance than simply moving the number of the fine.
Okay, so I don't see any more questions right now, so I just want to say thank you, Jodi, again. Thank you for rolling with the punches through our technical difficulties here, and it was a pleasure to have you, and I'm going to turn off the recording now.